worked in traditional finance for many years. I actually started my career in Tokyo, Japan, working in finance. I then worked here in New York City and Wall Street for a number of years for big firms. I was wondering what to do next, and I ended up speaking with my brother. My brother's been an environmentalist his whole life. He's worked in solar energy for many years, and he encouraged me to speak to some people who are working in that area. And to be honest, I was like, I'm not an environmentalist. I don't know anything about this area, and I don't know, why would they have any interest in my expertise? I started to learn about climate change. I got involved and became CEO of this company called Eco Securities, and that company financed emission reduction projects to tackle climate change in developing countries. And we actually built that business into quite a large company. We went public in 2005 and were eventually acquired by JP Morgan in 2009. And it was after that I became an academic. 20 years ago, we understood the climate challenge. The science was already pretty good at that point in time, understanding what we had to do to reduce emissions. What we didn't have 20 years ago, and I don't think we understood it very well at the time, there just wasn't much to invest in. To be perfectly honest, I mean, renewable energy was crazy expensive and really small scale. There was no electric vehicles. There was nothing to invest in. Fast forward to today, and the number of opportunities to invest has just grown dramatically. That I could have written it 5 or 10 years ago, or maybe even 20 years ago. Because now is when the actually real opportunity is to invest. This is when there's really exciting opportunity to do so. And there's a real need to do so, because at this point, the time frame to address climate change is that much shorter. We only have about 3 decades to put this capital to work and decarbonize. Pick a strategy and stick with it over the long term. When I say pick a strategy, there are a number of different ways to invest in the era of climate change. And these strategies depend on who the individual is or the business is that's investing. The book describes 5 strategies, so I won't spend too much time getting into each one in depth. But the first is obviously risk management. If you're concerned about climate risk, and there are a lot of risks to be aware of. Second strategy is what's called divestment. And this is really a strategy to align your personal values with your investments. So if you're really concerned about, say, oil and gas companies and their contribution to climate change, maybe you don't want to invest in those companies. And so you'd want to take those out of your portfolio. Third strategy is very controversial these days, called ESG investing. It's simply incorporating environmental, social, and governance factors into your investments. It's actually a relatively straightforward strategy. The controversies today are political. There's, from an investing perspective, actually very sensible. The fourth strategy is being much more aggressive about tackling climate change, and we call it thematic. So if you're really concerned about climate change, you're like, how can I invest capital? I still want to make a decent return on my investments, but what can really create change? And this is where you pick a sector. Let's say, again, renewable energy is a sector you care about, and you're like, that's really going to make a difference. I'm going to invest in renewables. I'm going to invest in solar and wind projects or stocks. That's a thematic strategy. And the fifth strategy is called impact first. It's actually kind of unusual, and most people can't do it. Impact first, where the investor says, wow, I really care about climate change. And I'm going to invest in things that most people won't invest in because they're too risky, they're too long-term, technology risks are very high, but they're really important. And investing in those climate solutions are really going to make a difference in the long run. This economic growth the last 300 years has really been remarkable. But there's a catch. And the catch is it's unsustainable. It's unsustainable because it was built on emitting greenhouse gases. So after 300 years of building that economy on the basis of emitting greenhouse gases, we now have about 30 years to totally decarbonize it, to take it all back down to zero. So how do you do that? You got to rebuild everything. Every business is going to have to restructure. Every form of producing energy and using energy is going to have to change. How do you do that? You got to invest. You got to invest capital. So just as investors of the last 300 years have been investing in building our economy, we now need to invest in decarbonizing our economy. Biggest trend by far is just awareness and interest in the area. So the amount of capital flowing the sector is growing dramatically. I first started working this 20 years ago. It was tiny. When I was first raising capital, it was extraordinarily hard just to raise a few $1 million. Over time, that has grown significantly and frankly now become mainstream. In fact, virtually every asset manager certainly in the US, but almost everywhere globally, now has some awareness and focus on climate change in some form. So that's the big change. It's now mainstream investing. The learning curve is an economic concept. It simply measures how much does cost of a climate solution, say like solar power, how much does it decline every time the industry doubles in size? And the importance of the learning curve is it allows us to forecast where costs are going. Well, why does that matter? It matters because if we're going to decarbonize our global economy over the next 20 years, if we're going to rebuild everything and get us down to net zero emissions, we need to know what the cost of the solutions are. And this is what a lot of investors get wrong, and actually a lot of policymakers as well. They get locked in the present. They look where things are today, and then they decide to make decisions around where we are today. Where we are today is not that important. It's where we're headed that matters. And if we know what costs are going to be, then we can see what demand's going to be. Because if we know what it costs, say, to generate electricity from solar, we know how many people will likely buy it at that point in time. So this little learning curve concept, this little economic term, it's a wonky term, actually turns out to be really useful to help us understand how to decarbonize our economy. When we think about funding climate initiatives, sort of put them in two buckets. One is in products that are already commercial on that scale, and this would be renewable energy, wind and solar, and electric vehicles, and a little bit of energy storage as well. What do we need to do there? We just need to do more of what we're doing, right? It's just increasing scale globally. So we're actually on the right path there. We just want to do that as much as possible, as fast as possible. And then the other technologies aren't yet commercial. They're not yet at scale. They're new technologies. We don't yet know how well they'll work necessarily or what they're going to cost in the future. So there you want to see investors being willing to take additional risk, willing to take longer time frames to really dig into these technologies. And it's not one or two technologies. There's literally hundreds and hundreds of technologies I've seen that are each really important to allowing us to decarbonize and individually need a lot more investment capital. The recent policies that have been enacted, but especially the Inflation Reduction Act, are incredibly important to this transition. The reason is, first, the size of the act. We're talking about $360 billion being allocated to climate solutions. But what's really important is the amount of investment that's going to go into these technologies is a lot more than $360 billion, because what that does is those tax credits and other subsidies, greater amount of private capital. So the effect of that bill will be over $1 trillion in investment. And what it will do is simply accelerate everything I was writing about in the book. So obviously, when I wrote the book, I didn't know this legislation was going to come. It was already in print at that point. And when I teach the subject, I really emphasize this, that these changes are going to be dramatic, and it's going to affect every company and every industry, and it's going to affect investment markets. And with change, there's always uncertainty, and then you sometimes do get speculative bubbles. This year, 2022, valuations come down a great deal, so I think that speculative bubble is sort of deflated. That's always a concern when things change dramatically, but it's not a great worry. My great worry is not speculative bubbles. My worry is we're not moving fast enough to decarbonize, given the pretty limited amount of time we have. So the easiest way is to invest one's capital, whether it's a very small nest egg or something larger, in climate solutions. So this could be mutual funds or ETFs. They focus on, for example, renewable energy. One can also invest in your own source of energy, for example, say solar panels on your roof. This actually turns out to be a pretty good investment for most people in this country, or community solar in your community. But the best way that many people can participate in addressing climate change is through their work. Because what you do as an individual is important, but for many people, what they do in their work can be much more impactful. So depending on what business you're in, maybe it'll influence that company to take action to reduce its emissions or its products or its services to customers and so on. And that can make an enormous difference as well. The one thing I would say to be aware of and stay away from is the risk of greenwashing. So you do get companies, you do get people in the sector who frankly hype what they're doing to address climate change. And I think they do that in two ways. Sometimes it's outright lying. They know that what they're promising is not going to come to pass. In other cases, I'm not sure that they're intentionally misleading, but they're making promises that they actually don't necessarily know how to keep, even though they want to make them. Their intention is to, but I don't know they will. So as an investor, you got to be pretty aware of that, because you invest in people's promises, and if those promises are greenwashing, that's not going to work out too well. Misunderstanding is that one segment of the population, fortunately, a shrinking segment, of course, we call those deniers, believes that climate change is not a big problem and we don't have to worry about it, or we can adapt. And, that's a problem, because we do need to worry about it and we need to address it. But there's another group that's actually a growing group at this point. And this is a group that essentially sort of given up on our ability to address climate change. They believe that it's so serious and so overwhelming that we cannot address it. And actually, this group's not too good either, because if you give up on addressing climate change, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It will become catastrophic. The misunderstanding is that neither one of those groups is correct. In fact, they're both wildly wrong. We are, in fact, in a situation where we're making some pretty good progress on the climate front, but not nearly fast enough. Let me give you an example. Most people believe that greenhouse gas emissions in the US just get worse every year, right? The US just continues to pollute. In fact, that's not exactly true. US greenhouse gas emissions peaked in 2007. For 15 years now, for 15 years now, we've been decreasing our emissions. We're actually getting better while growing the economy. What we need to really understand is that we've got the tools. We actually are doing it. We just need to move faster. In the short run, there's always going to be a lot of volatility in the markets. An example of that this year is what's happening in Europe. The war in Ukraine has created a lot of uncertainty around energy security. In Europe, there's a lot of strain in that area, and the markets reflect that. So energy prices shot up due to shortages and so on. The longer term trend of sustainable investing is the backdrop of climate change. Climate change is going to change how we invest over the next 30 years, no matter what. Whether one believes in climate change or not is kind of irrelevant to this. At the end of the day, it's physics, and it will change the world we live in and how companies operate, and ultimately how investors invest.
The audiobook, Investing in the Era of Climate Change, offers an indispensable guide to the risks and opportunities involved in climate change investing. You can download the audiobook from most online retailers. Learn more at wetwaremedia.com.